Okay, well let's get moving. The last slide we left off with the French connection last time was these. This is a map from another historical geography textbook by a chapter by a geographer by the name of Cole Harris, and the what you're looking at are the sort of the expansion of the fur trade toward the west from the St. Lawrence Valley, from Montreal for the most part, which is the base of operations for the French fur trade. And you can see here the period of expansion, according to Harris, is about 1679 to about 1685. So during this period, you have a movement outward of the French fur trading effort into the Great Lakes. So they beat the Dutch in terms of expansion into the continent, and certainly the English, who were just getting started down here along the Atlantic coast. So the French, remember, I try to make a lot of distinctions between French colonization and Dutch colonization, English colonization, of course Spanish. Spanish colonization is nowhere around this area at the moment. So the French disperse their operations. The French are interested in essentially the merchandise that can be procured from northern North America. They are interested in development of a commercial relationship with the indigenous peoples. They recognize the networks of indigenous peoples that allow for the fur trade across central and northern North America. And they exploit that, but their exploitation is one in which the European traders, Europeans are trading manufactured goods to the Indians, and that is a voluntary exchange. It is capitalism at work. And that voluntary exchange developed a very peaceful, very good relationship between the French and the French fur traders and the Algonquian, linguistically Algonquian and linguistically Iroquoian groups, with the exception of the Iroquois confederacy down here in New York. That was the realm of the Dutch and later the English. And the rivalry between the Dutch and the English against the French would play out in Indian country between the Iroquois Confederation and their enemies around the Great Lakes. So the Iroquois would expand at the expense of a lot of these native peoples who were allied with the French. But the French had much better relations, and this is something you read in all of the narratives about the French colonization in North America, is that the French had much better relations with the native peoples than any other European group. It was not a relationship of conquest. It was a relationship of articulation, or a relationship that was more or less on equal terms. In fact, the Frenchmen, as you know, went out and lived among native peoples, learned the language, lived in their settlements, acted like them, and the result was that we have the emergence of a mixed blood population referred to as the Metis. Here we go. All right, so here is a note card about what I'm talking about, and then we're at this point at least. So, in terms of the settlement of French Canada, the geography of French Canada is somewhat analogous to that of the Hudson Valley. We haven't talked about the Hudson Valley, obviously, but we will. The Hudson Valley of New York, in that it is a tidal estuary and it's relatively deep, but along the St. Lawrence Valley, it's an area of what we today call the Canadian Shield, or what you might call a granite region. It's an area that has been glaciated by continental glaciation. It has lost most of its best soils. Soils tend to be shallow and based on granite bedrock. Not only that, but the entire region of the St. Lawrence Valley and the Canadian Shield were compressed somewhat during the last ice age, and so they are in a condition of isostasy, where they're sort of springing upward, and that changes the river systems, the drainage patterns, so that they're fairly chaotic. Anyway, the Company of New France was the private sort of a public-private organization that had the charter to colonize the St. Lawrence Valley. They received a charter from the sovereign, from the King of France, and the requirement for the Company of New France was to bring in colonists. Okay? Now this is where I want to make a big distinction. While the Dutch and the English did successfully colonize, the English brought in the largest numbers of people. The French were never very successful at getting numbers of people on the ground in the St. Lawrence Valley, primarily because of the poor farmland, the lack of economic incentive other than the fur trade. So when people did come to New France, they, for the most part, moved out into the interior. They didn't stay in one place. They certainly, if they were going to raise crops, they weren't going to make much money at it. So the central, top-down planning effort of the French worked kind of like this. We're going to give land to these wealthy aristocrats in the St. Lawrence Valley, and they're going to have the job of bringing in settlers. So, for the most part, the Company of New France didn't work very hard at the settlement business. They were interested in the fur business, the fur trade. So what happened was, eventually, since the Company of New France was completely unsuccessful at bringing in settlers and colonists, agricultural settlers, the king, or the crown, the French government took over in 1663, and they began to bring settlers into the St. Lawrence Valley in any way they possibly could. All right, well, the Company of New France was involved in the fur trade. They also ignored the royal regulations that had been placed on the fur trade. Things like don't trade whiskey, don't trade firearms, that sort of thing. So I told you a little bit about that last time, that there was a very paternalistic approach to the relationship between the French and the Indians. But it was a top-down approach. So in other words, yeah, there were these regulations, but you know how that works, and there's nobody there to enforce it, so it probably was not recognized very much. So you have, one of the other regulations was the fur traders were not allowed to go very far into the interior. They were supposed to stay relatively close and develop connections with other Indian tribes, but they did. So they were, to some degree, illegally expanding into the interior. So they pretty much ignored the royal regulation against the movement of fur traders. These fur traders became known as Voyagers or coureur de bois. I mentioned that last time. Runners of the wood, basically these men who went and lived among the native peoples. They went far afield by following the river systems around the Great Lakes. The Great Lakes, of course, were formed by glaciers, so they have these, they're sort of indentions and compressed, and so the rest of the continent largely flows toward those Great Lakes. The main rivers from the north and the west and the south generally flow into the Great Lakes. So that meant that as long as you could, that following the Great Lakes system and then following the river systems that were tributary to the Great Lakes, following those upstream were natural trade routes, natural trade corridors. And that's where the French coureur de bois wound up. They wound up going as far away as the northern Great Plains, going up the Missouri River Valley, They went down the Mississippi Valley and up other river systems, including the Red River and the Arkansas River. And I think last time we talked a little bit about the French, by the late 1700s, early 1800s, even though it had turned over to American hands by 1803, this Louisiana Purchase country was actually occupied by French fur traders and really dominated by the French fur trade, even though they were now dealing more with St. Louis and the American fur trade. So those were the first Europeans to colonize this part of the world in Oklahoma. So the connections were through St. Louis, and then from St. Louis back to the Great Lakes all the way to Montreal. So it was territory of the United States, but the trade itself still continued to be somewhat through Canada and through old family lines. So the most important urban settlement or base of operations was Montreal. Earlier, an Indian city or village was known as Hochelaga, but Montreal is established, and it looks like 1842, but it's 1642. Anyway, this is the base of operations. All right, so that's the fur trade, and we'll come back and talk more about it. But the fur trade was the only thing that made much money really for the French in Canada. Agriculture would never be very productive at all and would never attract large-scale settlement. So the French crown turned to this system that it referred to as the seigneurial system. And it sounds kind of like seigneur, okay, and that means the same thing for the most part. It was a system of doling out land to aristocratic men, aristocratic families from France. And it was, for the most part, an attempt by the French government to transfer its own feudal system to the New World. Okay, and we've talked a little bit about how the Spanish transferred their feudal landholding system to the New World through things like the encomienda system and so forth. But here we've got another example. Okay, the seigneurial system allowed these aristocrats or lords, French noblemen, to receive very large grants of land directly from the crown. So large land grants to aristocratic families, and those aristocratic families then allocated smaller tracts to farmers, to peasant settlers, peasant farmers. Now, those small tracts were along the order of 50 to 100 acres each, which might sound like not very much, but in the 16th and 17th centuries, in the 17th century, it was adequate, okay? For a general French-style farming settlement, farm. The aristocratic lords then also required the peasants to provide labor to build, this was all in the rules, to produce or to construct and maintain infrastructure, things like roads, particularly roads, but also perhaps bridges and other just generally transportation infrastructure. So the landowners weren't going to do that. They put that requirement on the people who were going to settle on their land. They also provided some degree of services to the farmers, for the most part, marketing of crops. That was the deal. They produce the crop and then they get it to the market back in Europe. So this system was one that was never very successful because, number one, the investors have not a lot of possibilities to make large amounts of money. That is, the aristocratic lords. They did build some houses and that sort of thing, but the land just was not incredibly productive. Soils weren't good. Growing season, of course, was very slow. So the type of agriculture that was even possible was, for the most part, a subsistence form of agriculture. They didn't even have much of a marketable surplus of crops. And this is up in the northern part of, this is northern North America. So short growing season, that also limits you to different, what sorts of crops were even capable of being produced. Well, things like oats, barley, potatoes, turnips, for the most part, the same sorts of crops that people grew in Northern Europe. And they had livestock, but not large numbers of livestock. They did produce some dairy products, but it was, for the most part, a subsistence style of agriculture, not a commercially lucrative form of settlement. And that, for the most part, was the problem. The French could never get colonists to New France. The French could never get colonists to New France. That's the problem. So the French government, of course, being a top-down, system, sort of a command and control hierarchical system, began to look around, and they eventually began to round up people from northwestern France and even even prostitutes in Paris, okay, and move them, transport them by, not by choice, but to transport them to this new place. In other words, if we can't get people to go there voluntarily, we'll just force some people to go, all right? Now, about 40%, let's see, by 1750, okay, we're looking at the work of Cole Harris, a geographer here. By about 1750, the area of New France, the St. Lawrence Valley and the coast of the Gulf of St. Lawrence, had only about a population, only about 10,000 Frenchmen. Only about 10,000 people of European extraction. They're referred to as habitants, okay, habitants. And those settlers or habitants were composed around about 40% of whom were indentured servants. These were people who had fallen into debt or people who wanted to get to the New World somehow, so they eventually sold their labor or sold their freedom beforehand for a set amount of time. We'll talk more about indentured servitude, typically 4, 5, 6 years, something like that, to pay for your passage over to the New World. And that was basically you're leasing your labor for a good chunk of your life in order to take care of that. So either to take care of the debt or to get you there in the first place. About 35% of these people were released soldiers. These were people who, for one reason or another, found it advantageous maybe to stay in the New World or to wind up trying to have a farm. There were prisoners. There were, as I said, streetwalkers in Paris. And the problem here is that most of these folks, indentured servants, released soldiers, and prisoners, were all men. So you see about well over half of the population are men, something like that, and not very many, and not only men, but military men, and then Catholic Church, well, they're not going to add much to the reproductive force of the population either. So there weren't very many women at all, and with not a lot of economic incentive to go there and no women, you didn't have a very rapidly producing or rapidly reproducing population. So this is an area that's dominated by men that doesn't have family settlement really. Maybe a few small families, but it's a very, very slow growth settlement. Kind of like this lecture is really slow at the moment. So, all right, I'll try to hurry. So very few women equals a very slow population growth. The aristocratic seigneurs failed to collect or produce much of a surplus. They couldn't get the peasants their settlers to engage in the quitrent, or the quitrent refers to that basically a tax. So they're not even owning the land, but they have to give a certain amount of labor every year to construction of roads, something like that. So they couldn't get the settlers to really work for them. Obviously, this is becoming a problem. So, for the most part, the settlement of New France was largely a flop, except for the fur trade. Now, if we compared those habitants who came to New France, if we compared them to other people living, other peasants living in France, then we can say that they actually enjoyed better lifestyles, or at least for a peasant, at least. There's the same friendly fly again, okay? Anyway, we have, they had better nutrition because they had better foodstuffs. They didn't have taxation other than the quitrent, and they didn't have to join the military. They weren't conscripted like people back in France were. So in that sense, these Frenchmen had a bit more freedom. They had a bit more freedom, and they had more food. So nobody was really hungry, nobody ever got rich, and the type of agriculture was generally subsistence, although fairly self-sufficient. Now, the other thing about, and I think we talked about this last time, was that, if you're a peasant in France, your future is pretty much determined, right? You're going to be a farmer. You're not going to have much of an opportunity to move up in terms of social class. But in the New World, it's not so much that you had an opportunity to increase your social status, but at least in the New World, you didn't get conscripted. You weren't going to be rounded up and taken off to fight and die in some battle somewhere. And the social norms were different. That's an important one. In North America, the church didn't have the reign on everybody's lives as it did back in France. And there were no taxes, really. So the government was weak. The government didn't allow or didn't have control of your life, like the church maybe in France and the government in France. So for the most part, this was a really important one. People in New France enjoyed some freedoms that other Frenchmen didn't. So the French colony of Canada was never territorially expansive, but it did get along generally with the cooperation of the native peoples. It was, for the most part, the largest region, what we might call a functional region, where there's interaction going on, there's trade taking place. For North America, the French had the largest functional region, but it was incredibly sparse. It was really dispersed. The French did not have a real strong dominating presence whatsoever. They were concentrated, for the most part, in one little strip along the St. Lawrence Valley. They didn't threaten the native peoples really at all in that regard. Sure, there were diseases that went through and decimated populations, but not active military force and not colonizing, not threatening native people's land base. So that's something that we have to really keep in mind. So a very broad, scattered area for the French. Any questions about this so far? All right. Now let's look at some patterns. And excuse me, but I hand drew these. So they're my own kind of sketches, just to sort of illustrate some things. In the to look at what we would call a seigneurie, or basically one of these land holdings, settlement in New France, whether it was in Canada or around St. Louis or in South Louisiana, followed the same guidelines. And it goes by different names. Most people would say long lots, but there is a term known as the Arpent survey. Arpent is actually actually a measure. It's a unit of measure, kind of like a yard or kilometer or something like that. But we're not really concerned about that. The type of survey that the French created was one that was elongated and perpendicular to rivers, sometimes perpendicular to roads, but for the most part perpendicular to rivers. And so the land holdings in the seigneuries and the peasant farms were doled out in these elongated long lots. Those long lots intentionally fronted the river. They included the higher land along the natural levee of the river. And that's one thing that may sound kind of confusing, but if you're in a very broad floodplain, like the Mississippi River or South Louisiana, along one of the bayous in South Louisiana, or along the St. Lawrence. St. Lawrence is not so much of an issue when it comes to flooding, but say you're in South Louisiana or the lower Mississippi River Valley, the safest place to be, of course, during a flood, within a floodplain, is as close to the river channel as you can be, all right? So in other words, where you want to have your permanent settlements are right along the riverbank, because this is an area that's actually raised up generally higher than all the land behind it, because it formed into something called a natural levee. Whenever the river floods, sediment is dropped closest near the river channel. So that gradually raises, and I'm kind of exaggerating here, but it kind of raises the bank of the river up a little bit. And water then, during a flood, will drain away from the main channel back into this area. So in a time of flood, this area would be a swampy area. It would probably not be used for much of anything except maybe timber or grazing livestock or something. The good farmland is going to be the well-drained stuff, fairly close to the river, to the natural levee. So the peasant farms, or the peasants along the St. Lawrence and farmers along the Mississippi River would establish their farmsteads, their house and the barn and outbuildings very close to the river bank, and then they would cultivate those fields toward is farther away from the riverbank. Eventually, you would wind up with a fairly low ground that can only be used for grazing by animals, and then eventually you might the lot may extend as far away as the floodplain moves away, as the floodplain goes up. So the boundary of the floodplain might actually have hilly land over here. So these long lots are on the order of several miles long, okay? And anyway, let's talk about that survey. What are some qualities of it? Number one, it's a fairly easy survey, basically parallel lines that are all perpendicular to a river channel, that for the most part eliminates the problem of property line disputes. So these are the survey lines, so individual properties are doled out to people along the river. They're not going to have a chaotic survey system that would make for disputes about property boundaries. It also, and importantly, allowed all of the farms to have equal access to various types of terrain. You have the high ground next to the river, you have the good cultivated, well-drained land, you have maybe some grazing land, maybe some forested land. So you have access to different resources, and every lot, every farm has access to similar sorts of resources. It also begins to create what we call a dispersed river settlement. So note that the farms can be all have similar amounts of land, but the community is created by having the farmsteads relatively close to one another and accessible to one another by river. So people tended to travel, of course, when they're shipping things out or in by water, but on either side of the river, you would also have a road that would follow the river. And so all of the main roads in places like this generally follow the river along the natural levee. So they're all connected by road and by water. In the case of the St. Lawrence Valley, the early days, the lots were on the Arpent surveyed lots were on the order of 50 to 100 acres. And this Arpent survey tended to allow for pretty broad territorial expansion because all of the settlements are going to be located on rivers. They're all going to be located on transportation systems. So this is one way that the French were able to expand quite to far distances because they would always be connecting by water. Now this was not anything really brand new because in the case of the French coming into the St. Lawrence, most of these people were coming from northern France, from Brittany and from Normandy. And they had actually practiced similar sorts of settlement. You can go to France and see the same sort of river villages today that have been there since way before the establishment of New France. They also brought with them Norman style of architecture, use of fieldstone, tended to be whitewashed, sometimes with some stucco on it, thatched roofs. The landscape looked a lot like Normandy for the most part. So anyway, just note the upland grazing area, maybe forest for timber, farmland, and well-drained soils here. Not only that, I didn't mention that, of course, we all know that alluvial, river bottom soils tend to be some of the very best. So, lots of organic material, also fairly well drained, loamy soils. This is just some actual examples of some places. This is around Montreal. And here are some other examples just for comparison sake. We've got Arpent long lots in Quebec. And then compare those with what other settlement areas would have. Say, for example, in the English settled areas in the Tidewater region, or this would be the Tidewater region, I guess, for the English settled area. So, in other words, farmers would go out and, find land that they wanted and then have that surveyed and then purchase it from whomever. And over time, you have lots of different boundaries intersecting with one another without GPS or anything. Of course, the survey would often get confused, and courthouses would burn and that sort of thing, and records would be lost. And there were lots of disputes over land, over boundaries for property. So this was a problem that was, for the most part, avoided by the French. And I should also mention that even though we generally associate this system with the French, the Spanish also used it. In fact, the Spanish may have even introduced it into South Louisiana before the French, but that's kind of up for debate. All right, well, let's look at this old, very basic map to give us an idea of where we are in terms of territory. By 1667, this is a century before, almost a century before the French would lose their holding in North America. This is New France, and the French in North America have the majority of the eastern half of the continent. Of course, the Spanish are claiming the rest, but the Spanish have never had a very significant presence, not like the French do. The French are actually around this area, and communication works and everything, and they have good alliances with the native peoples. The English colonies by 1667 are claiming, for the most part, everything to the 1667 to the Appalachians, but it's kind of a very vague zone right through here. The British would also claim Hudson Bay, and so the British and the French would begin to have overlapping claims in the northern part of Canada. But for the most part, the French were in control of everything. And notice also that the French have this area. This is what I'd like to talk about now. What do we call this peninsula today?
Halifax, Nova Scotia.
Nova Scotia, yeah. Today we call it Nova Scotia, or New Scotland, right? It was originally colonized by the French, however, and held by the French until the 1750s. So let's talk about that. The area, in fact, early on, let's go back to it, this area, this peninsula became known as Acadia. Acadia. And the French colonized Acadia along the Bay of Fundy. What do you know about the Bay of Fundy?
50-foot tides.
Fishing.
Yes, exactly. Let's go back here. Here's the Bay of Fundy, just to give you a little bit of an idea here. Whoop. All right. Pick up. All right. So here's the Bay of Fundy, and it is known as a part of the world that has some of the highest tides in the world. I mean, unbelievable tides. My dad was working in this area one time, and he watched a tide come in. It was like 38 feet, a 38-foot tide, in and out twice a day. Amazing stuff. And anyway, so this area was colonized by people from northwestern France, from Brittany and Normandy. And just like in the St. Lawrence, the crown required fur companies to establish colonies. Okay, so in this case, for the most part, this was an area that was not part of this large fur trading economy, right? So you actually had some areas that were the thing about the area, the land around the Bay of Fundy, because of those high tides, you had salt marshes. Salt marshes had developed where you have this twice daily inrush of salt water, and then outward. So this was an area that was attractive, believe it or not, to people from Brittany and Normandy. In Brittany and Normandy, they had long practiced for centuries land reclamation, kind of like they do in the Netherlands or in Holland. So they didn't use windmills. They used a form of sort of folk engineering with sluice gates that allowed, that kept out seawater, and then when you would have, this only really works in a very moist climate, whenever you would have rainfalls and the rivers would fill up, or rivers would drain, the gates would open this way and allow the rainwater to wash out and sort of cleanse the land of salt, and then they would close up whenever the rains ended and keep the saltwater tide from inundating. So over time, their sort of folk civil engineering allowed them to reclaim land. And that was that was just a transfer of the same way of life, the same land use that they had practiced in the Bay of Biscay. The Bay of Biscay is that area off the coast of France. You've probably seen it. So they reclaimed a lot of that land in Nova Scotia or in Acadia, and this attracted actually lots of people. And farmers came in. The fur trade, of course, was going on, but they also had access to the Grand Banks and to the fishery. So fishing and farming and trapping all worked together. And this, even though it was kind of isolated, the population of this area actually took off. And there was also a population of native peoples on Acadia, on the peninsula, known as the Micmacs. And so these folks tended to intermarry with the Micmac people. Over time, an urban focus really didn't develop much. What was anything close to an urban focus was at Port Royal, and that emerged around the 1660s or something like that. But for the most part, let's talk about life in Acadia versus France, or for that matter, versus the St. Lawrence Valley. St. Lawrence Valley is a huge area. This is a relatively small area. There was not any significant movement of furs through this area. So because it was a peninsula, almost an island, it was for the most part cut off from that main fur trade commerce. So it had to be an area where people could make a living for themselves and be self-sufficient. Like the St. Lawrence Valley, there were no taxes, okay? And the aristocrats didn't show up. The aristocrats didn't intend to establish a feudal land tenure system in Acadia as they did in the St. Lawrence Valley. Because of that, there were no quitrents, no taxes. There was, essentially no church presence at all, right? And anything that was, any religious influence that was brought was generally just voluntary, brought in by the people. But these were farm families that came in. They didn't have any real representation in France, but they didn't have the aristocratic land holdings that they had over in the St. Lawrence Valley. And for the most part, they were ignored by France. They were just, it was a colony that was a poor colony, but they actually did fairly well. If you compared them to folks back in France, they had a fairly, they were very well fed, and they supplemented their agriculture, which, they grew sort of the same things you would find people growing in northwestern France, but they also supplemented with hunting and fishing and fur trapping. And hunting was really important because that was something that Frenchmen had never done really in France for subsistence. They reclaimed the salt marsh, and again, they were doing actually pretty well. They actually had a higher or lower mortality rate in Acadia than they did back in France. And with a lower mortality rate, they actually had, and more to eat, they generally had a higher rate of natural increase. So the Acadians did pretty well. They were isolated, but they were living off the land, and they understood the land generally because they had learned a lot of this stuff from the Micmac Indians. Compare, 10,000 people remember 10,000 people in the St. Lawrence Valley in 1750 compared to 13,000 people in this little area around the Bay of Fundy. So this was actually an area that had significant population for the size. Large families, early marriage, development of big extended families, and with family settlement, you had more or less rapid population growth. So this was an area, let's go back to this area, remember? Let's look at the, whoops. Here's the St. Lawrence River Valley. We've got, by 1750, well, between Montreal and Quebec for the most part, a very large area, only about 10,000 people. And that's including the fur traders in the backcountry. And if we can compare that, we were looking at this area right here, okay, compared to this area, for the most part, right around here, right around the Bay of Fundy, 13,000 people. So a more concentrated population. Now, in terms of their material culture, they brought with them some of the material culture of northwestern France, including a style of house that became known as the Creole house. I'll show you an example of that. The pirogue, anybody know what a pirogue is?
The type of boat?
It's a type of boat, yeah, exactly.
Like a canoe.
It's like a canoe, exactly. It's like a, now they have those stand-up boards, what do you call them? Paddle boards, right? Kind of like a paddle board, except it's more like a canoe, little canoe. You stand up in it and you pole, basically. And the pirogue is designed for allowing you to move fairly quickly as an individual through relatively shallow water. So, and of course, placid, shallow water. So through canals and stuff like that. So a pirogue is a small boat. Maybe get you an example of that. Distinctive cuisine based on not just the types of crops that they brought from France, but also wild game. And also wild game that was trapped. So fur-bearing animals were also consumed. in some cases. Okay? A distinctive type of music associated with the northwestern part of France that included the violin or the fiddle, maybe the viola, I'm not sure, but certainly the violin or the fiddle. What else? You guess? From northwestern France. Musical instruments.
A French horn.
Yeah, I don't know about the French horn. The accordion, okay? Accordion. So the accordion and the violin, accordion and fiddle, kind of the two main instruments. They also had, since they were isolated, and these were people coming from a certain province of France, or a couple of provinces, they were already fairly distinctive people in French terms. But when they landed in Acadia and they had lived there for 100 years without really much interaction with the rest of the world, incorporating lots of native words into their speech, and like any other group of people, their dialect and their speech began to diverge from other patterns in France or even in the more connected parts of the St. Lawrence Valley. So they were isolated. They developed their own dialect. They developed their own stories and folklore, their own clothing. Their clothing was adapted to the marshy conditions of Acadia. Now I have to jump way forward into the 18th century to bring this story to some conclusion. And at the beginning of the 7 Years' War, around 1755, the British, and I say the British, but I'm referring to the Massachusetts folks in New England, the Yankees in New England, began to really covet that land along the coast. Now, New England didn't have very good cropland whatsoever. And the English were looking for more cropland. They couldn't really go to the interior at all, so they went up the coast. And the New Englanders eventually wound up forcing these Acadians out of their own home. They were attracted to the agricultural promise of Acadia. And by the time the French and Indian War begins, these people had already been essentially displaced by British, and also the British Navy, the British Crown were beginning to assert themselves into Nova Scotia, and of course we rename it Nova Scotia from Acadia. So these Acadian refugees, by the 1750s, 13,000 or so, began to leave. Some of them went back to France. But of course, going back to France is going back to a France that you and your parents and grandparents never knew. These were people that had been living in the wilderness of North America, and they, going to France was a new world for them. They had intermarried with native peoples. They had Indian blood, a lot of them. So a lot of them chose not to go back to France. Some went to the Caribbean, but most of us know them as finding refuge in South Louisiana, where there was a French presence around New Orleans in the lower Mississippi Valley. And these people, these Acadians, were allowed to come in and settle, even though the people in New Orleans were Caribbean French and Creole French. They were generally people who had upper class connections and well-connected, educated people growing tobacco and sugar and a few other crops in the South Louisiana area. There was a need for more farmers and more farming and more food production. But there was one area to the west of New Orleans, west of the Mississippi River, up the bayous, Bayou Teche and Bayou Lafourche in particular, to the west of New Orleans and west of Baton Rouge, that was, for the most part, uninhabited. It didn't have many people living there because it was swampy and marshy, subtropical, and these people were attracted to that, okay? They left Acadia, they left a marshy country that they had reclaimed, and they went to South Louisiana, and they found a similar sort of environment where they could bring their folk agriculture, their folk culture, their accordion and fiddle music, their taste for wild game and seafood, and they became known. The term Cajun is obviously an English corruption of Acadian. Right? So the Cajun people arrive. And the Cajuns largely avoided the city. They didn't want anything to do with New Orleans. So they settled out on Bayou Teche and Bayou Lafourche. They settled in with their existing lifestyle of self-sufficient agriculture and living off the land, intermarrying with the Houma Indians and the other native peoples of South Louisiana. Here's a map of the Bay of Fundy and Acadia. These are the Acadian settlements and the Acadian marshlands that they had reclaimed. So you can see it's not a very large area. It's just for the most part along the east or south bank of the Bay of Fundy and up into the tributaries to the head of the Bay of Fundy. So not a huge, not a lot of different settlements, but enough to have a significant population in a relatively small area where people could interact. Okay, so let's take a little breather. Any questions about Acadia or Acadians? The Acadians and the Cajuns would continue to live down in South Louisiana fairly isolated. We tend to associate, a lot of people who don't know South Louisiana much will tend to associate New Orleans with Cajun culture, but you shouldn't. It's different, and the cuisine and certainly the language is different. Acadian or Cajun culture is focused more on the area around the town of Lafayette, Lafayette, Louisiana. So, and it's sort of what we call a triangle of settlement from about Lafayette down toward New Orleans. Okay, now let's go back up a little bit and try to finish talking about the French in North America. This last card it's kind of getting hard to see, so I'll make sure I scan a better copy of this for you. There was a war between the English and the French in the early part of the 18th century that ended with something called the Treaty of Utrecht, 1713, the Treaty of Utrecht. And what this did was it wound up surrendering some of the lands of the French, held by the French, to the British. And the reason for this is because France was willing to give up land that they claimed in North America in order not to lose land elsewhere, and not just in France, but also in the Caribbean. Because by this time, by the early part of the 1700s, the place where the money was really being made was down in the Caribbean. Places like Barbados and the Sugar Islands, for the most part, of the Caribbean were making huge amounts of money. And that's what people were really concerned about. Up in Canada, well, there are the Acadians living up there, isolated, not bothering anybody. The fur trade was going all right, but nobody was making any money in St. Lawrence Valley. There are a few other places, but anyway, the areas that were more or less handed over to the British, technically Acadia, Newfoundland, Hudson Bay area, and that's why you have this this legitimate claim by the British into Acadia, and they forced out these French settlers. So anyway, by 1713 or so, you get this extension of English around the French area. So let's back up just a little bit and look at that map here. So this is about 1667, but with all of this land becoming British and the British colonies beginning to grow down here by the early 1700s, and then Newfoundland turning over to the British. Basically, the French were getting hemmed in. The French were getting surrounded, except for the far west, where the Spanish were, for the most part, holding land. So the French were looking to hold on to an empire, but they were losing it in the north. And so they began to move their operations as far west as they could, which meant going to the Mississippi River. So the expansion of the fur trade west had been fairly early. It led to the development of this native population, or this population of mixed ethnicity or mixed blood people of Native American and French population, who became known in some areas to the west of the Great Lakes and the northern Great Plains as the Metis. The Metis, what you might think of them as sort of the French version of the mestizo population of Mexico, the Native American and Spanish descendants. So they weren't as numerous as the mestizo population, but certainly important, and having a mix of European and Native American lifestyle. We talked about Auguste Pierre Chouteau, the guy who was running the area around Salina, Oklahoma. Chouteau, the Chouteaus were Métis for the most part. They were mixed blood, Native American and French. But they were, they had connections to the European market and to the Native American fur trade. So they were sort of middlemen culturally and economically. The Métis specialized in trading with the Plains Indians. The Métis up in Minnesota and the Dakotas, the present-day Dakotas, they specialized in trading with the Plains Indians. And the Plains Indians, of course, were bison hunters. By the middle part of the 1700s, late 1700s, the Plains tribes had already expanded into the Great Plains on horseback. And they had become wonderful, they had a culture that was flourishing based on equestrian skills and raiding and hunting bison, hunting buffalo, bison. And the Plains tribes had a surplus of bison meat. So they traded that with these Métis groups who were also buying up their buffalo robes. They were interested in the buffalo robes. They were interested in beaver pelts from the Rocky Mountains, and buffalo or bison meat, which they preserved as something known as pemmican, which is kind of like a sausage, kind of like a bison sausage. It was a cured form of meat, kind of like, I guess, the closest thing I could guess would be something like a Slim Jim, except a really big Slim Jim. Not necessarily jerky, but not necessarily sausage. Something in between, with probably lots of salt. So anyway, this was something that it was a preserved form of meat that became kind of a commodity in the northern plains. It became a trade good, an important trade good, which they did pretty well. So they were kind of the middlemen in that trade as well. So these, I won't trouble with going through all this. We've already talked a little bit about the coureur de bois and their use of the birch bark canoe to go upriver, because the French are riparian people. They move upstream and downstream, and they were able to carry these goods, pemmican, buffalo robes, European trade goods, with the birch bark canoe. The birch bark canoe was, of course, a Native American invention. During heavy snows, another Native American technology was absolutely critical: the snowshoe. Okay, snowshoes were part of this trade. All right, let's go on down the Mississippi toward the area around St. Louis and present-day Indiana and Illinois. This was the area that became known to the French as the Illinois country. So after 1713, after the Treaty of Utrecht, for the most part, the French try to shift what they can into the interior, into the Mississippi Valley. And that allows them to have some kind of control over the Mississippi Valley. And of course, by this time, by the mid-1700s, New Orleans is very important. It's becoming more and more important as the trade pivot for the Gulf of Mexico and the Mississippi River, and therefore the interior. So New Orleans, very, very important place. And protection of New Orleans meant if you can control the Mississippi Valley, then you could also make sure that New Orleans continues to be held by the French. Now, there are some other areas. The Illinois country was contained a couple of locations, but it was, for the most part, focused on a few places. Kaskaskia, which is around present-day St. Louis, on the Middle Mississippi River, and by about 1769, it had a population of around 600 people, not very many people at all. And so this is, very much a frontier outpost for the French. What did they do? They raised cattle. They grew corn, which they shipped downstream to New Orleans for the most part. New Orleans had a demand for food, and Kaskaskia was an agricultural production area to supply New Orleans, shipping food, beef and pork and wheat, and probably not corn, but wheat, downstream to New Orleans. A few other places are of importance across the entire continent, included choke points, places where the fur trade was funneled through and therefore had to be protected by the French. One was basically, if you've been to, you know what Michigan looks like, right? Like this, and the Upper Peninsula. The northernmost point is a place called, was referred to as Michilimackinac. That was a place where the fur trade came together and developed as a place where furs would be repacked and put onto larger boats to ship to the St. Lawrence. Another one is Arkansas Post, which you can probably guess is along the Arkansas River. It was a place where the Caddoan people of Arkansas and the lower Mississippi traded, including people in this part of, in Oklahoma, who were Caddoan-speaking people. They were Wichitas for the most part. The Wichitas had control of a lot of Oklahoma. So they traded with the French at Arkansas Post. They also traded with the French at their post on the Red River at Natchitoches. Talked about Natchitoches a little bit. This would become an early French outpost, kind of like New Orleans, very early on. Natchez is another one along the Mississippi River Valley where the French were kind of hemmed in by the Chickasaws. The Chickasaws were allied with the English. They were not allies of the French. And so the Natchez settlements were, for the most part, areas that were oriented toward the fur trade, and later on would become an important area for cotton production. And then, of course, there's New Orleans. And I didn't mention Louisburg. You might say Louisburg, but Louisburg was a naval fortress established by the French on the outer part of Labrador, I believe it was. But it was basically a big military fortress that the French government created that never really had much significance. It was intended to be sort of the St. Augustine of the French against the English. Remember what St. Augustine was? Today's, unfortunately, with the hurricane over in the Carolinas, but it's a perfect example of a horrible storm hitting North Florida, or I guess it just grazed North Florida and it's hitting South Carolina and North Carolina today. But St. Augustine, of course, is a safe harbor was a safe harbor for Spanish galleons. So it was a place not only to get away from the English privateers, but also to get away from storms and keep the ships from sinking. Of course, lots of those Spanish galleons are still out there somewhere, having been sunk by storms and by pirates. All right, so wrapping up, French settlement of the interior was late. It was uneconomical. It was incredibly sparse in terms of population. And it was, in some cases, way too politically motivated and centralized, that is, directed by a central power that was planning something, which made it really not very lucrative and not very sustainable. So the fur trade itself wound up becoming more or less unsustainable because of why? Well, what time do we have here? My watch isn't plugged in over there. 10, 12? Okay, great. So over time, the fur trade itself, because it was an extractive activity, would wind up in the fur traders and the Indians. Okay, I have to say the Indians because they're the ones doing most of the trapping here. They wound up thinning out and even wiping out the beaver and other fur bearers in most of their areas. So the fur trade went through a crash, and it would actually be one that would continue to crash through the 19th century until furs became not that in demand. As far as agriculture was concerned in the St. Lawrence Valley, never profitable. Never something like the tobacco areas of Virginia, that would attract people wanting to make large amounts of money. All right, so that's about it. Thanks for sitting the whole time, and I hope this didn't bore you to tears. But if you haven't read about the French, go ahead and do that. And then next time I believe we're talking about the Dutch. I'm not sure right off the bat, but I'll let you know. And I'll let you know when I get some of this stuff posted for you, okay? So have a great weekend. Go Cowboys. Oh, no, we want to say go Pokes because it's Cowboys versus the Cowboys, right? Okay. Yeah. We'll say Pokes.